Six drug dealers, six different cities decades apart. A DC crack kingpin, a Los Angeles street dealer who went national, a dentist with a double life, twin brothers who never touched a gram of product. Every one of them built an empire, and every one of them lost it, not gradually, but because of one specific decision that undid everything almost overnight. People hear drug dealer goes to prison and assume the ending was inevitable. It was not. Each of these six men had a real window where a different choice would have kept the machine running. What makes these stories worth telling is exactly which mistake caught them and how ordinary it looked in the moment. Rayful Edmond III. Rayful Edmond III grew up at 407 M Street NE in Washington, D.C., about a mile from the U.S. Capitol, in a household where both of his parents worked government jobs during the day and sold drugs on the side. By the time he was in his early 20s, Edmond had built what federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most dominant crack cocaine operations the city had ever seen, controlling by some estimates close to a third of the entire cocaine market in Washington during the height of the crack epidemic. His organization moved as much as 1,700 pounds of cocaine into the city every month, generating roughly $2 million a week. He was 22 years old when he had already made millions. Edmond lived the part completely. Custom silk suits, diamond jewelry, courtside seats at Georgetown Hoyas, basketball games, sponsorship of local basketball tournaments, and frequent trips to Las Vegas for major boxing matches. He was young, visible, and unmistakably rich in a city where that combination made him both feared and, in certain corners, genuinely admired. Prosecutors later nicknamed him the Babe Ruth of crack cocaine for the scale of what he had built and how quickly he had built it. The single mistake that ended it started with a relationship. Edmond had been involved with a woman named Alta Ray Zanville, and in December 1987, a photograph of the two of them together was seized during an unrelated raid on an apartment she had rented for him. That photograph put a name and a face together in a way investigators had not previously had. Months later, in May 1988, 4 men were arrested in Los Angeles for attempting to buy $1 million worth of cocaine from an undercover officer. Facing serious charges of their own, they began cooperating, and the name they gave investigators was Rayful Edmond. From there, the case built quickly. Zanville herself agreed to wear a hidden microphone for the government, and the conversation she recorded became devastating evidence at trial. On April 15, 1989, Edmond was arrested along with 28 associates, 11 of them members of his own family. A 43-count superseding indictment followed weeks later, charging him under the same continuing criminal enterprise statutes used against organized crime families, alleging responsibility for at least 150 kilograms of cocaine and 1.5 kilograms of crack. His trial ran under extraordinary security, with an anonymous jury protected for its own safety. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Even life in prison did not immediately end his influence. From behind bars at a maximum security facility in Pennsylvania, Edmond continued orchestrating drug deals through coded telephone calls, exploiting gaps in prison monitoring systems that nobody had anticipated an inmate exploiting so thoroughly. Special investigative services at the prison later noted that Edmond made clear, even from a cell, that incarceration was not going to stop him from getting what he wanted. When that pattern was discovered, he received an additional 30-year sentence on top of his existing life terms, a second conviction built entirely from behavior he engaged in after he had already lost everything once. Eventually, he began cooperating with federal authorities himself, providing testimony in cases that led to additional indictments of former associates and earning a significant sentence reduction in 2021. It was a striking reversal for a man whose organization had once been built on the same absolute demand for loyalty that defined every other figure in this story, and it underscores something that would repeat across nearly every case profiled here. Cooperation, once one man in an organization chooses it, tends to become the mechanism that eventually reaches everyone above him. He was released to a residential re-entry center in Nashville in 2024 after 35 years inside, and died 5 months later at a Florida facility of a suspected heart attack. He was 60 years old, and he had spent more of his life incarcerated than free, all traced back to a seized photograph and a handful of desperate men in Los Angeles who talked to save themselves. As one longtime Washington Post reporter who had covered the era later observed, Edmund was never the only major dealer operating in the city at the time, but he was the one whose downfall became a symbol for an entire chapter of Washington's history. Freeway Rick Ross. Ricky Donald Ross grew up in South Central Los Angeles and stumbled into the cocaine trade almost by accident through a connection made at a community college where an upholstery teacher first introduced him to the business. What turned that small start into one of the largest crack distribution networks in American history was a single relationship: his connection to a Nicaraguan exile named Oscar Danilo Blandon. Blandon could supply cocaine at prices that undercut every other source in Los Angeles, reportedly as low as $10,000 to $12,000 a kilogram at a time when other dealers were paying $35,000 to $40,000. That price gap was the entire engine of Ross's empire. He converted the powder into crack and moved it through a network of sub-distributors across South Central, Compton, and Inglewood, then expanded into Seattle, New York, Miami, and eventually cities as far from Los Angeles as Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Indianapolis, and St. Louis. By his own account, he was a millionaire by 23, and estimates of his total lifetime earnings from the trade have run into the hundreds of millions. What Ross did not know and would not learn until years later was that his suppliers' network had connections running back to the Nicaraguan Contras, and by extension, to a much larger and more politically explosive story that journalist Gary Webb would eventually break in his Dark Alliance series for the San Jose Mercury News. Ross was not managing that complexity. He was managing product and price, and the price Blandon offered was too good to walk away from, even after Ross had been arrested and imprisoned once already in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Unlike some of the men in this story, Ross did try to convert some of his fortune into something durable. He invested heavily in Southern California real estate, including a property he called the Freeway Motor Inn, the source of the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. His rise was significant enough that by January 1985, local, state, and federal authorities had formed a dedicated unit, the Freeway Rick Task Force, built for the sole purpose of ending his operation, an unusual level of institutional attention for a dealer still in his mid-20s. He evaded that first sustained pressure campaign for years, at one point relocating operations to Cincinnati with a girlfriend and rebuilding an entirely new distribution network from a suburban home, eventually pushing his product into Cleveland, Dayton, Indianapolis, and St. Louis, using the same underlying Nicaraguan supply chain that had built his Los Angeles empire in the first place. The mistake that finished him for good came after his first release. Blandon had been arrested himself and had narrowly avoided a life sentence by agreeing to become a paid informant for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Ross did not know this. In the fall of 1994, believing he was helping an old friend and mentor who claimed to be under pressure from Colombian suppliers and desperately needed money, Ross agreed to arrange a deal: 100 kilograms of cocaine for $170,000 down. They met in a parking lot near San Diego on March 2, 1995. It was a DEA sting from the start, engineered by the very man who had made Ross rich in the first place. Because it was his third felony conviction, Ross was sentenced to life in prison under federal mandatory minimum laws, the same 100-to-1 crack sentencing disparity that Congress had passed in 1986 and that disproportionately punished crack offenses compared to identical quantities of powder cocaine. Ross used his time inside to teach himself to read at a functional level for the first time and eventually won a reduced sentence of 20 years walking free in September 2009. He later became an advocate and public speaker, using a theater he purchased as an outreach center. But the empire itself, the one built on a single unbeatable price from a single supplier, ended the moment that supplier decided his own freedom mattered more than Ross's. Larry Lavin. Larry Lavin's story does not look like the others on this list at first glance, and that is exactly what made it so effective for so long. He grew up working class in Philadelphia, attended Phillips Exeter Academy, and went on to the University of Pennsylvania's dental school on an Ivy League track that should have led to nothing more dramatic than a comfortable suburban practice. Instead, starting with casual marijuana sales to fraternity brothers in college, Lavin built a cocaine distribution operation that eventually generated more than $60 million a year, stretching from Miami to Boston to New Mexico, while he simultaneously ran a legitimate dental practice and raised a family in one of Philadelphia's wealthiest suburbs. His logic for the switch from marijuana to cocaine was, according to his own later account, purely practical. Marijuana was bulky and smelled, making it hard to move in growing quantities without detection. Cocaine was compact and easy to conceal, and the profit per pound was exponentially higher, a calculation Lavin later summarized as the difference between carrying an elephant on your back and carrying one in your pocket. He recruited fellow students and young professionals rather than street-level operators, building what investigators eventually nicknamed the Yuppie Conspiracy, a network of dealers who looked, dressed, and socialized like the young professionals who made up much of their customer base. Lavin ran his dental practice by day and his empire at night, and for years, neither side of his life appeared to touch the other. The roots of Lavin's confidence went back even further than college. At Phillips Exeter Academy, where he had arrived from a working class background into one of the most elite prep school environments in the country, Lavin was already known among his peers as someone drawn to risk in a way that set him apart. Someone friends could easily imagine getting pulled into exactly the kind of scheme that later defined his adult life. That early reputation for pushing boundaries without consequence followed him into dental school and then into his practice, reinforcing a belief that he had simply figured out a system other people were too cautious to exploit. The mistake was not one moment, so much as an accumulation of overconfidence that eventually caught up with a federal investigation that had actually been watching him for far longer than he realized. As his operation scaled, so did the paper trail, the cash that needed laundering, the couriers who needed managing, the properties and vehicles bought under increasingly thin cover. The FBI's investigation eventually seized 85 kilograms of cocaine between 95 and 99% pure, worth an estimated $20 million on the street, along with extensive financial records connecting Lavin to the operation. Facing the reality of the case against him, Lavin made the decision that ultimately sealed his fate beyond even the drug charges. He fled. He disappeared for months, moving under assumed identities before FBI agents finally caught up with him as he disembarked from a fishing boat in Virginia Beach, Virginia, arresting him without incident on a pier in front of stunned onlookers who had no idea who he was. The flight itself, layered on top of the underlying drug conspiracy, transformed his case from a serious but survivable prosecution into a far harsher sentencing outcome. Lavin's story became the basis for journalist Mark Bowden's best-selling book, Dr. Dealer, which chronicled just how far a genuinely talented and charismatic young professional could build an empire in plain sight, and just how completely one decision to run rather than face the case head-on could compound everything that came before it. Chris and Jeff George. Chris and Jeff George were identical twins operating in South Florida during the late 2000s, and they have found a version of the drug trade that did not require street corners, gangs, or violence in the traditional sense at all. They opened pain management clinics, most notably one called American Pain, and staffed them with doctors willing to write prescriptions for oxycodone with minimal or no real medical justification. Patients lined up outside their clinics, sometimes waiting in chairs set up on the sidewalk, forming lines that surveillance footage would later show stretching around the building. The scale of what they built was staggering. Their clinics ranked among the top 9 purchasers of oxycodone in the entire country. Between 2008 and early 2010 alone, prosecutors alleged their pill mills distributed approximately 20 million oxycodone pills and generated more than $40 million from illegal sales. Across the full run of their operation, the brothers are believed to have trafficked more than $500 million worth of opioid pills. They lived the lifestyle that kind of money buys. Multiple homes, boats, expensive watches, and in Chris George's case, a silver monster truck that became something of a local symbol of the wealth their clinics generated. At their flagship clinic, a bouncer stationed at the entrance warned arriving patients not to snort their pills in the parking lot, a small operational detail that reveals how consciously the brothers understood exactly what kind of business they were running while still presenting it publicly as legitimate medicine. Patients traveled from other states specifically for the reputation the clinics had built among people seeking prescriptions with minimal medical screening, and the lines outside became visible enough that neighbors and passers-by regularly reported them to authorities long before the federal case came together. Investigators eventually built their case under an operation nicknamed Oxy Alley, a reference to how concentrated the pill mill business had become along a specific stretch of South Florida. The mistake in this case was not a single decision, but a pattern of denial that federal investigators had been documenting for far longer than the brothers understood. In November 2009, 3 people on their way to one of the George clinics died when their car was struck by a train after the driver tried to weave through the lowered crossing arms. An associate called Chris George to relay the news, and George's recorded response, asking only whether the news coverage identified them as pain clinic patients, revealed exactly how the brothers had come to view their customers, not as patients whose lives were their responsibility, but as a liability to be managed for public relations purposes. Investigators had already been listening to that very call. 2 years later, that recorded conversation became part of a federal indictment charging the George with racketeering and drug trafficking in what officials described as the largest, most sophisticated painkiller trafficking organization in the country. The human cost behind the financial numbers was staggering. The FBI later estimated, based on a review of patient files, that roughly 3,000 people died from overdoses connected to prescriptions written at the brothers' clinics, an estimate that did not even account for pills that were resold into a secondary black market once they left the clinic doors. Chris George pleaded guilty and served a lengthy sentence. Jeff George pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and was separately convicted of second-degree felony murder in the fatal overdose of one specific patient, receiving an additional 20-year sentence on top of his other time. Florida's legislature passed a statewide pill mill law in 2011 specifically in response to what the George brothers had built, banning the exact business model that had made them briefly 2 of the wealthiest men in the state. Alberto Alpo Martinez. Alberto Martinez's Harlem operation in the 1980s was built alongside his closest friend, Rich Porter, a partnership that had started in childhood and grown into one of the most recognized and, in Porter's case, genuinely respected drug crews in the neighborhood's history. Porter was known for generosity and community standing in a way that set him apart from many of his contemporaries, while Alpo built a reputation defined more by aggression and control. Together, along with a third partner known as AZ, they had accumulated enough money and street power to be recognized as major figures in Harlem's drug economy at its most lucrative and most violent moment. The mistake that ended everything was Alpo's decision to murder his own partner. As their operation grew, Alpo became convinced that Porter was shorting him on shared profits, keeping money that belonged to both of them rather than dividing it fairly. Whether that belief reflected the true scale of what was happening or was distorted by paranoia and bad information circulating around him is something that has never been fully settled. What is not disputed is what happened next. In December 1990, Rich Porter was murdered, and Alpo Martinez was responsible. Killing his own partner did not end Alpo's ambitions. In the aftermath, he expanded his operation into Washington, D.C., attempting to replicate the kind of dominance he had built in Harlem in a new city where his name did not yet carry the same weight or the same scrutiny. For a period, it worked, and Alpo's D.C. operation grew quickly, feeding off the same crack epidemic that had made Rayful Edmond a fortune in the very same city. But a man who has already demonstrated he will kill the person closest to him over a financial dispute is not a man other people want to stay loyal to once real pressure arrives. And pressure arrived in the form of a federal case that eventually caught up with him on separate charges. Facing that exposure, Alpo made the decision that defined the rest of his life more than even the Porter murder had. He became a cooperating witness, providing extensive testimony to federal authorities about people above and around him within his network. The code against cooperating with law enforcement is one of the most fundamental in the world Alpo had operated inside, and his choice to cooperate, layered on top of already having killed his own partner, made him one of the most reviled figures in that world's memory. The devastation that followed Alpo's rise and fall was not confined to him alone. Rich Porter's brother, Donald, was kidnapped and killed in a separate but related incident the same year his brother was murdered, a second loss that tore through the same family within months. Their sister, also named Donald in his memory, would later become a prominent advocate working to address gun violence in New York, transforming decades of personal grief into public work that continues today. The story of Alpo and Rich Porter has since been retold repeatedly in rap music, documentaries, and journalism to the point where the facts and the legend have become difficult to fully separate. But the underlying event at the center of it, one childhood friend killing another over money, remains as documented and as unambiguous as anything in this list. He was relocated through the Federal Witness Protection Program and lived under a protected identity for years. It did not save him permanently. In 2021, he was shot and killed in Washington, D.C., found despite decades spent trying to disappear. The Flow Heroin Network. Not every drug organization on this list operated at the scale of a cartel or a national pill mill chain. Some were smaller, block-level operations that nonetheless moved enough product and caused enough harm to draw the full weight of a federal investigation once the wrong person died. That is the story of the heroin network that branded and stamped its glassine bags with the name Flow, distributing heroin out of the Bronx and eventually far beyond it. The organization, led on the street by a man known to his network by the alias Guille, along with a partner known as Checker, built a distribution pipeline that ran not just through Bronx neighborhoods, but out into smaller markets that had far less law enforcement presence and far less tolerance for a sudden overdose spike than New York City did. Starting around 2010, the organization pushed heroin north into rural Vermont, a market where a steady, branded product like Flow could dominate quickly precisely because there was so little local competition and so little existing law enforcement infrastructure built to handle a heroin influx from a major city. The mistake was the same one that has ended countless smaller organizations across the country. A customer died, and that death happened in a place small enough that it could not be absorbed quietly the way a similar death might have been in the middle of a much larger city with dozens of overdoses happening in the same week. The Flow organization's heroin was linked to the death of a man in Rutland, Vermont, and that single fatality in a state with nowhere near the overdose volume of New York triggered exactly the kind of full-scale, resource-intensive federal investigation that a busier jurisdiction might not have mustered for a single death. Investigators traced the supply chain backward from Vermont into the Bronx, building a case that eventually connected the network not just to heroin distribution, but to an attempted murder of a rival dealer, evidence of the same violence and territorial protection that runs through nearly every organization profiled in this list. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York unsealed an indictment charging the organization's leadership with conspiracy to distribute heroin from 2010 through 2015, along with weapons charges tied to the attempted murder. What had functioned for years as a profitable, relatively low-profile Bronx operation, moving enough product to matter, but not so much that it drew constant scrutiny, ended because a single death in a small New England city could not be ignored the way a similar death might have disappeared into a much larger city's overdose statistics. There is a particular irony in how the branding itself contributed to the case against them. Stamping every glass iron bag with the same word, flow, was a deliberate business decision, the same kind of product branding that legitimate consumer goods companies use to build customer loyalty and repeat purchases. It worked exactly as intended, building a recognizable, trusted product in a heroin market where users often gravitate towards specific stamps they have come to associate with strength and reliability. But that same branding consistency became a gift to investigators once the Vermont death put law enforcement on the trail, because a stamped bag recovered at an overdose scene functions almost like a signed confession, directly tying a specific batch back to a specific supply chain in a way that unbranded product never could. The organization's own marketing strategy, built to maximize repeat business, was the exact trail investigators followed home. Look at these 6 stories side by side, and a pattern becomes visible that has nothing to do with geography, drug type, or scale. Rayful Edmond was undone by a seized photograph and a handful of scared men in Los Angeles. Freeway Rick Ross was undone by trusting a supplier who had already decided his own freedom mattered more than their friendship. Larry Lavin was undone not by the drug charges themselves, but by the decision to run rather than face them. The George brothers were undone by a recorded phone call that captured exactly how little their customers' lives meant to them. Alpo Martinez was undone by murdering the one person whose loyalty should have been unbreakable, then by choosing to break the same code again when his own freedom was on the line. The Flow Network was undone by a single overdose in a place too small to look away from it. None of these are stories about incompetence. Every one of these men displayed genuine skill at building and running a large, complex operation under constant threat of arrest, betrayal, and violent competition. Rayful Edmond ran a logistics network, moving nearly a ton of product a month through a single American city. Larry Lavin managed a national distribution business while completing dental school and maintaining a practice good enough that his patients never suspected a thing. Chris and Jeff George built something closer to a corporate enterprise than a street operation, with staff, standardized procedures, and a supply chain running directly through licensed medical professionals. Competence was never the missing ingredient. What was missing in each case was the specific kind of self-awareness required to recognize the one relationship or the one decision that carried a different category of risk than everything that had come before it. None of these men were undone by the drug trade itself, at least not directly. They were undone by trust extended to the wrong person, by decisions made in a moment of a panic rather than calculation, by a single conversation that revealed more than they realized, or by the specific arrogance of believing that whatever had worked for years would keep working indefinitely. Every one of them had built something that looked from the outside permanent. Millions of dollars, loyal networks, years of operating without serious consequence. And every one of them learned in a single moment that in hindsight looks almost mundane, that nothing about what they had built was as stable as it appeared. These 6 men spanned 4 decades in 5 states, and most of them never operated in the same city at the same time, with one notable exception where 2 of their empires briefly overlapped in the same neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. What connects them is not friendship or rivalry. It is a shared blind spot, the specific kind of overconfidence that develops in anyone who has built something large enough to feel untouchable. Every one of them had already survived close calls before the mistake that finally ended things, and that survival is precisely what made the final mistake possible. Men who have gotten away with risk before tend to stop recognizing which risks are actually different from the ones they have already survived, and that is, in the end, the real through line connecting a DC. Crack kingpin, a Los Angeles crack pioneer, an Ivy League educated dentist, a pair of Florida pill mill twins, a Harlem partnership that ended in murder, and a small Bronx heroin brand that reached rural Vermont. Empires built on an illegal product, no matter how large or how well run, are always exactly one mistake away from collapse. The mistake rarely announces itself in advance. It looks in the moment like just another decision among thousands of others that had already worked out fine. It is also worth noting what these 6 stories collectively do not show. None of these organizations collapsed because a rival outcompeted them on price, or because demand for their product dried up, or because the underlying business model stopped working. Every one of them was still generating enormous revenue at the exact moment everything ended. That detail matters because it means the businesses themselves were never the vulnerability. The vulnerability was always the people running them, and specifically the moment each of them stopped treating a single relationship, a single decision, or a single death as different in kind from all the risks they had already absorbed and survived. In an economy with no legitimate safety net, no way to diversify away from catastrophic exposure, and no institution capable of absorbing a single catastrophic mistake, that miscalculation is rarely available to make twice. There is also a generational dimension worth sitting with. Edmund and Alpo built their empires within a few years and a few miles of each other, feeding off the same crack epidemic tearing through the same East Coast cities. Ross was doing something almost identical on the opposite side of the country at nearly the same moment, independently discovering the same crack economy and the same vulnerabilities that came with it. Lavin and the George brothers, separated by 2.5 decades, both discovered that a legitimate professional credential, a dental license in one case, a network of complicit physicians in the other, could function as camouflage good enough to delay federal attention for years longer than a street-level operation ever could. And the Flow Network shows that the same fundamental dynamics, branded product, expansion into underserved markets, and a single overdose triggering disproportionate scrutiny was still playing out in the Bronx as recently as the 2010s, largely unchanged in shape from what had destroyed empires 3 decades earlier. The drugs changed, the cities changed. The specific mistake that ended each empire never really did. What separates these 6 stories from cautionary tales in general is how little warning any of them actually got. There was no slow slide, no gradual erosion of the empire that gave anyone time to adjust or retreat. Edmund went from controlling 1/3 of a city's cocaine market to facing a 43-count federal indictment inside a matter of weeks. Ross went from being courted by his own supplier to being arrested by that same man's federal handlers in the span of a single meeting. Lavin's flight from Virginia Beach lasted months, not years, before agents found him on a fishing pier. The George brothers built a legal-looking business for the better part of a decade before a single overheard phone call became the centerpiece of the case that ended it. That speed is arguably the most important part of the pattern, because it means the men in this story never had the luxury most legitimate business owners take for granted: the chance to see failure coming and adjust course before it became irreversible. In their world, the failure and the ending were almost always the same event.